The interstellar correctional facility drifted through the void like a tumor on the galaxy's conscience, its crystalline walls reflecting starlight in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't designed to contain the universe's most spectacularly dangerous individuals. Of course, dangerous was a relative term in a facility where the classification system had been devised by committee, which explained why the human in Cellblock 7 was rated as an emotional volatility class 7 threat, roughly equivalent to a particularly moody teenager with access to sharp objects. The prison's architects in their infinite wisdom had designed the facility around the revolutionary concept that different species required different approaches to incarceration. Revolutionary, that is, if you ignored several millennia of evidence suggesting that treating prisoners like laboratory specimens rarely ended well, but the Galactic Penal Consortium had invested too much in their species-specific containment protocols to let little things like historical precedent interfere with their scientific approach. Guard Captain Thickwar examined his datapad with the sort of methodical precision that came from processing the same information for the 1000th time. His 4 eyes moved in synchronized patterns across the display, while his chitinous fingers tapped out a rhythm that his species used to indicate mild irritation mixed with professional resignation. The human in Cell 7 Alpha had been crying for 3 weeks, 2 days and 14 hours. The precision mattered, apparently, because the behavioral analysis team required exact temporal data to chart the psychological deterioration curve. Still at it, observed his subordinate, a bipedal creature whose name was an ultrasonic shriek that the universal translators rendered as something approximating whistles when nervous. The guard's comment carried the sort of casual dismissiveness reserved for predictable phenomena, like gravity or bureaucratic incompetence. The facility's approach to human containment was considered a masterpiece of enlightened penology. Rather than relying on crude physical restraints, the administration had developed a sophisticated psychological containment system based on their extensive research into human emotional responses. This research, compiled from exactly 14 captured humans over the past century, had revealed that humans were catastrophically fragile when subjected to isolation and sensory manipulation. The human in Cell 7 Alpha served as a perfect validation of their theory. Captured during what the authorities had classified as an illegal terraforming incident, the prisoner had initially displayed the typical human responses: aggression, defiance, and an amusing tendency to make threats that would have been impressive if humans possessed the physical capabilities to carry them out. But 3 weeks of carefully calibrated psychological pressure had reduced the creature to a sobbing mess, exactly as their models predicted. His reefing peaked at 0347 last night, Thickwar noted, consulting his readings. Intensity level 7.4. Duration 43 minutes. Well within normal parameters for a Class 7 emotional breakdown sequence. Whistles when nervous. Adjusted one of the monitoring devices with the sort of practiced efficiency that came from managing predictable routine. The human containment system was their pride and joy, a network of sensors that monitored everything from heart rate to vocal stress patterns, feeding data to the behavioral analysis computers that tracked the prisoner's psychological state with scientific precision. The cell itself was a marvel of species-specific design. The walls were made of a material that appeared solid but transmitted sound at frequencies calibrated to maximize human anxiety. The lighting cycled through patterns that disrupted human circadian rhythms while remaining imperceptible to most other species. Even the air composition had been adjusted to create a subtle sense of unease without causing actual physical harm. The behavioral team wants to know if we should implement Phase 3 of the isolation protocol, Whistles when nervous mentioned, scrolling through his daily directives. Thickwar's mandibles clicked in what passed for a chuckle among his kind. Look at the readout. Phase 3 is for subjects showing resistance to psychological pressure. Our specimen is performing exactly as expected, complete emotional collapse within the predicted time frame. The truth was, the human's constant weeping had become something of a comfort to the guard. It provided a steady audio backdrop to their shifts, as reliable as the facility's life support system. The behavioral analysts had explained that human tears served as a stress relief mechanism, essentially allowing the prisoners to exhaust their emotional reserves until they reached a state of malleable compliance. Other species in the facility had adapted to the sound in various ways. The crystalline beings in Cellblock 5 found the frequency soothing and had requested to be moved closer to the source. The gas-form prisoners in the environmental containment units seemed entirely indifferent, though their emotional states were admittedly difficult to assess. Only the reptilian species in maximum security had complained, claiming the sound interfered with their meditation cycles, but their complaints were filed under non-essential grievances. The prison's chief of operations had visited Cell 7 Alpha twice in the past week, each time expressing satisfaction with the human's deterioration rate. The facility's psychological containment protocols were being studied by correctional institutions across 3-star systems, and the human represented a perfect case study in species-specific incarceration technique. The morning shift reports the subject consumed only 60% of its nutritional allocation yesterday. Whistles when nervous, noted. Consistent with predicted appetite loss during advanced psychological breakdown. Thickwar nodded approving. Everything was proceeding according to their carefully crafted models. The human would continue its emotional descent for another week, perhaps 2, before reaching the compliant stupor that marked successful psychological containment. At that point, the prisoner could be transferred to the minimum security wing, where it would serve as a docile example of enlightened correctional methodology. The weeping continued, echoing through the corridors with the same reliable rhythm it had maintained for weeks. It had become part of the facility's ambient sound, as natural and unremarkable as the hum of the life support systems or the periodic announcements from the administration. Some guards had begun timing their rounds to the creature's sobbing cycles, finding the predictable pattern oddly reassuring in the sterile environment of deep space incarceration. As Thickwar completed his log entries and prepared for the shift change, he reflected on the elegance of their containment system. Physical force was crude, expensive, and often ineffective, but psychological manipulation, that was an art form, refined through careful study and precise application. The human in Cell 7 Alpha represented the pinnacle of their scientific approach to corrections, a living testament to the superiority of enlightened penology over barbaric physical restraint. The weeping continued, steady and predictable, just as it had for 3 weeks, 2 days and 14 hours. Dr. Vextiani had built her career on the precise measurement of suffering, though she preferred the more academically palatable term psychological stress quantification. Her laboratory occupied an entire wing of the facility's research division, filled with monitoring equipment that could detect emotional distress down to the molecular level. She had published 17 papers on species-specific psychological responses, each one adding another layer of scientific legitimacy to what was essentially the galaxy's most sophisticated torture program. The human in Cell 7 Alpha had become her masterpiece, a living validation of 3 decades spent studying the intricate machinery of despair. Her monitoring systems tracked everything from cortisol fluctuations to micro-expressions, feeding data into behavioral models that predicted psychological breakdown with the sort of precision typically reserved for orbital mechanics. The creature's emotional collapse was unfolding exactly as her equations suggested it should, which filled her with the warm satisfaction that came from watching theory align perfectly with practice. Subject exhibits classic markers of learned helplessness, she dictated to her recording device while examining the latest batch of readings. Stress hormone levels remain elevated but show periodic cycling consistent with exhaustion recovery pattern. Vocal distress indicators have stabilized at predicted frequencies. Recommend maintaining current environmental parameters. The beauty of human psychology, from a research perspective, was its delicious predictability. Unlike the stoic endurance of the rock beings from Kepler 442, or the chaotic emotional fluctuations of the methane breathers from the Vega system, humans followed clear behavioral patterns when subjected to controlled psychological pressure. They fought briefly, bargained desperately, then collapsed into emotional ruins with mathematical precision. Her research had identified the optimal formula for human containment, isolation combined with sensory manipulation, administered in carefully calibrated doses to prevent permanent psychological damage while maintaining maximum compliance. The Galactic Ethics Committee had approved her protocols after extensive review, praising the humane alternatives to traditional physical restraint methods. The fact that psychological torture was still torture seemed to have escaped their attention, but academic institutions had never been particularly good at recognizing convenient moral complexities. The monitoring data revealed fascinating details about human physiology under stress. The subject's tear production had remained remarkably consistent, averaging 2.3 milliliters per hour during active weeping episodes. The salt content varied with emotional intensity, creating a natural barometer of psychological distress that her instruments tracked with obsessive precision. She had already submitted preliminary findings to the Journal of Xenobiological Psychology, confident that her human subject would provide material for at least 6 more publications. Guard rotations through Cellblock 7 had become surprisingly popular among the staff, though not for reasons the administration officially acknowledged. The various alien species working at the facility had developed distinctly different reactions to the humans' constant weeping. The insectoid guards found the rhythmic sobbing oddly hypnotic, often timing their patrol circuits to synchronize with the creature's emotional cycles. The aquatic species claimed the sound reminded them of tidal movements on their homeworld, while the energy-based lifeforms seemed to feed off the emotional resonance, reporting improved morale after shifts in cell blocks. Only the reptilian contingent expressed any discomfort with the arrangement, filing formal complaints about the disruption to their meditative practices. Vixtoni had studied their grievances with scientific interest, noting that species with slower metabolisms appeared more sensitive to prolonged emotional stimuli. She made a note to investigate whether this represented a broader pattern that could be applied to other correctional facilities. The human's original crime had been thoroughly documented, though the details revealed more about galactic politics than criminal behavior. The prisoner had been part of a terraforming expedition that had attempted to establish a colony on a disputed world in the neutral zone. The planet had been uninhabited, suitable for human colonization, and technically outside any recognized territorial boundaries when the expedition arrived. However, the Galactic Resource Authority had subsequently claimed the world for strategic mineral extraction, making the human settlement retroactively illegal. Standard procedure would have been to relocate the colonists and file the appropriate paperwork, but the expedition had committed the unforgivable sin of refusing to abandon their new home. Worse, they had established a functioning agricultural system and begun broadcasting their success to other human colonies, potentially encouraging similar unauthorized expansion. The authorities had responded with their typical efficiency, arresting the expedition leaders and sentencing them to correctional rehabilitation. Most of the colonists had been transferred to minimum security facilities after demonstrating appropriate contrition for their presumptuous behavior. But this particular specimen had shown disturbing signs of leadership potential and ideological persistence, earning a transfer to the maximum security facility for intensive psychological adjustment. Vixtoni's preliminary assessment had classified the subject as a potential revolutionary, requiring the full application of her species-specific containment protocols. The transformation had been remarkable to observe. The creature had arrived displaying typical human arrogance, making speeches about inalienable rights and colonial sovereignty, threatening legal action, demanding contact with human diplomatic representatives. Standard human responses to authority, well documented in her research literature. But 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated psychological pressure had reduced the specimen to its current state of sobbing compliance. Her monitoring systems revealed the precise moment when the subject's resistance had finally collapsed. The breakthrough had occurred during the 2nd week, marked by a sudden spike in stress hormones, followed by the onset of continuous vocalized distress. Since then, the creature had exhibited perfect behavioral compliance, consuming provided nutrition, following basic commands, showing no signs of aggressive or escape-oriented behavior. The success had attracted attention from correctional facilities across the galaxy. Vixtoni had fielded inquiries from 17 different star systems, all requesting detailed information about her human containment protocol. The Galactic Penal Consortium was considering adopting her methods as the standard approach for managing human prisoners, which would establish her reputation as the foremost expert in human psychological manipulation. Her research had also revealed fascinating insights into human social behavior. The subject occasionally made vocalizations that appeared to be directed toward other prisoners, though the universal translators had difficulty parsing the meaning. Humans apparently possessed some form of rudimentary empathic communication, possibly related to their pack bonding behaviors. Vixtoni had made notes to investigate whether this represented a security concern, though the subject's current psychological state suggested minimal capacity for organizing resistance activity. The weeping continued with the same reliable periodicity that had marked the past 3 weeks, each sob carefully catalogued and analyzed by her sophisticated monitoring equipment. The sound had become so integral to the facility's routine that she had begun using it as an audio marker for her research logs. The human's distress had transformed from a correctional challenge into a fundamental constant, as reliable as the facility's atomic chronometers, and considerably more useful for her research purposes. As Dr. Vixtoni completed her daily observations and prepared her status report for the administration, she reflected on the elegant simplicity of psychological containment. Physical barriers were expensive, energy-intensive, and often ineffective against determined prisoners, but a thoroughly broken spirit required no walls, no guards, no sophisticated security systems. The human in Cell 7 Alpha represented the future of enlightened corrections, a completely compliant subject, maintained through nothing more complex than carefully applied despair. The silence began at 0247 hours during the graveyard shift, arriving with the sort of abrupt finality that made seasoned corrections officers deeply uncomfortable. Guard Klaxon 9 noticed it first, pausing mid-stride during his routine patrol when the familiar backdrop of human sobbing simply stopped. The sudden absence of sound felt wrong, like discovering that gravity had taken an unscheduled break or that the laws of thermodynamics had decided to try something new. Klaxon 9's sensory apparatus, finely tuned through evolution to detect the subtle changes that preceded dangerous situations, registered the shift immediately. His species had survived 3 major extinction events by developing an almost supernatural ability to recognize when familiar patterns broke down, and the cessation of the human's weeping triggered every survival instinct his ancestors had passed down through 40 million years of cautious existence. Unit 7 Alpha has gone quiet, he reported to the night supervisor, his voice carrying the sort of careful neutrality that corrections officers used when reporting potentially significant events that might or might not require immediate action. Supervisor Grextel consulted his monitoring systems with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades learning that hasty decisions in a maximum security facility usually ended badly. The readouts showed the human was alive, heart rate steady, respiration normal, body temperature within acceptable parameters. Biologically, the specimen appeared stable. Behaviorally, however, the data presented something of a puzzle. Probably exhaustion, Grextel concluded after examining 3 weeks' worth of crying cycles. The research team predicted eventual vocal fatigue. Dr. Vixtoni's models suggested the weeping would taper off as the subject approached complete psychological compliance. The explanation satisfied the immediate administrative requirements, but it failed to address the peculiar quality of the silence itself. This wasn't the gradual reduction of someone falling asleep, or the intermittent quiet of someone pausing between emotional outbursts. This was the complete, immediate cessation of sound, as if someone had simply decided to stop crying and moved on to something else entirely. Morning shift arrived to find the human sitting upright in the center of its cell, staring at the wall with the sort of focused attention that suggested deep contemplation, rather than catatonic stupor. The creature responded normally to basic commands, consuming its nutritional allocation, following hygiene protocols, acknowledging guard communications with appropriate subservience. But the weeping, which had become as reliable as the facility's chronometers, remained absent. Vixtoni arrived 3 hours early for her shift, summoned by reports of anomalous behavioral changes in her primary research subject. Her initial examination revealed nothing obviously concerning the human. Appeared docile, responsive to verbal commands, and showed no signs of aggressive behavior. The monitoring equipment registered normal physiological readings across all measured parameters. What troubled her was the subtle wrongness that seemed to permeate the entire situation. The human's posture, while compliant, somehow suggested alertness rather than defeated resignation. Its responses to questions, though appropriately submissive, carried an undertone that her linguistic analysis software couldn't quite categorize. Most disturbing was the creature's habit of moving its head in small, precise increments, as if listening to sounds that the monitoring equipment couldn't detect. Run a full diagnostic on all sensor arrays,
She ordered her technical staff. I want every monitoring system in Cellblock 7 recalibrated and verified. The diagnostics revealed the first hints that something fundamental had shifted in the facility's carefully controlled environment. 3 separate monitoring stations reported intermittent signal degradation. The acoustic sensors showed periodic static bursts that coincided with the humans' meal times. Most puzzling, the environmental controls in Cellblock 7 had developed a tendency to fluctuate in ways that the maintenance computers couldn't explain or correct. By the second day of silence, other prisoners had begun exhibiting unusual behavior patterns. The crystalline beings in Cellblock 5, who had previously found the humans weeping soothing, became increasingly agitated and began producing harmonic resonances that interfered with communication systems. The gas-form prisoners, normally indifferent to emotional displays, started clustering near the ventilation systems that connected to Cellblock 7. Most concerning was the behavior of the reptilian prisoners in maximum security. Their previous complaints about the humans crying had been replaced by an entirely different kind of distress. They reported disturbing dreams, disrupted meditation cycles, and a general sense of unease that their species associated with impending territorial conflict. The facility's behavioral analysis computers fed 24 hours of silence, where they expected continued vocalized distress, began generating error reports. The psychological prediction models, calibrated around the assumption of ongoing human emotional breakdown, couldn't process the absence of data they had been designed to interpret. Vextani found herself staring at screens full of algorithmic confusion, watching her carefully constructed theories dissolve into statistical noise. Perhaps the subject has entered a new phase of psychological adjustments, suggested her research assistant, a multi-limbed creature whose species specialized in pattern recognition. The models might require recalibration to account for post-breakdown behavioral modifications. Dr. Vextani nodded absently while studying the latest batch of readings. The explanation made sense from a theoretical perspective, but it failed to account for the increasingly strange behavior of the monitoring equipment itself. Sensors that had operated flawlessly for years were developing mysterious malfunctions. Environmental controls were responding to commands with subtle delays that suggested systematic interference rather than random mechanical failure. The third day brought the first major system failure. The primary acoustic monitoring array in Cellblock 7 went offline during the morning shift, displaying error codes that the technical manual claimed were impossible under normal operating conditions. Repair crews found evidence of microscopic corrosion in the sensor housings, as if something had been systematically degrading the equipment from the inside. Saltwater damage, the chief technician reported, holding up a corroded circuit board. Highly concentrated saline solution, applied with remarkable precision to the most vulnerable components. Dr. Vextani examined the damaged equipment with growing unease. The corrosion patterns were too systematic to be accidental, too precise to be the result of environmental factors. Someone or something had been methodically sabotaging the monitoring systems, using what appeared to be highly concentrated tears as a conductor to short-circuit the delicate electronics. The human, when questioned about the equipment failures, responded with the same submissive compliance it had shown since the weeping stopped. The creature denied knowledge of any sabotage, expressed concern for the facility's technical difficulties, and offered to cooperate fully with any investigation. Its responses were perfectly appropriate, textbook examples of reformed prisoner behavior, but Vextani noticed something else in the human's manner, a subtle quality that her translation software interpreted as sincerity but that triggered deeper warning signals in her predator-adapted nervous system. The creature wasn't lying, exactly, but it wasn't telling the complete truth either. It was navigating the conversation with the sort of careful precision that suggested extensive planning and deliberate misdirection. As the facility's technical teams worked to repair the damaged monitoring systems, other signs of systematic disruption began to emerge throughout the prison. Minor equipment failures, subtle environmental fluctuations, and communication glitches that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested coordinated interference with the facility's infrastructure. The human remained silent, compliant, and perfectly cooperative, but its silence had transformed from the absence of weeping into something far more ominous. The quiet of someone who had finished gathering information and was ready to act on what they had learned. The facility's administrators, focused on repairing their sophisticated monitoring systems, failed to recognize the most important change of all. The sound echoing through Cellblock 7 was no longer the weeping of a broken prisoner, but the silence of someone who had stopped being a victim and started being something else entirely. The cascade began at 1834 hours, on the fourth day of silence, when the environmental control system for the entire facility experienced what the technical logs would later describe as spontaneous coordinated failure across multiple redundant systems. Vextani was reviewing her latest batch of incomprehensible data when every monitoring screen in her laboratory went dark simultaneously, followed by the sort of profound mechanical silence that indicated something fundamental had broken beyond repair. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through the corridors as backup power systems struggled to maintain basic life support. In the sudden chaos, Guard Captain Thakvar made a discovery that recontextualized 3 weeks of careful observation. The human in Cell 7 Alpha was no longer sitting in passive compliance. Instead, the creature had somehow accessed the cell's maintenance panel and was methodically connecting exposed circuits with thin strands of crystallized salt, the residue of tears that had been carefully collected and refined over weeks of apparent psychological collapse. The weeping Thakvar whispered, his 4 eyes processing the implications with the sort of horrified clarity that comes from watching a perfectly reasonable universe suddenly reveal itself to be operating under entirely different rules. It was never emotional break. The human looked up from its work with an expression that Dr. Vextani's research had never catalogued. The patient satisfaction of someone whose long-term plan was finally reaching fruition. The creature had been using its own tears as a conductor, methodically mapping every electrical system in the facility through careful application of saline solution to vulnerable circuits. Each sobbing session had been a reconnaissance mission, each emotional outburst a cover for systematic intelligence gathering. Your acoustic monitoring systems are quite sophisticated, the human remarked conversationally, its voice carrying none of the broken submissiveness that had characterized its behavior for 3 weeks. The sound-dampening materials in these walls create excellent echo patterns. I've been able to map the facility's entire structural layout just by listening to my own voice bounce around the ventilation systems. The revelation struck Dr. Vextani with the force of a paradigm shift. Her carefully constructed theories about human psychology hadn't been validated by the prisoner's behavior. They had been exploited by it. The creature had studied her research methods, identified the patterns her monitoring systems were designed to detect, and had then performed those patterns with theatrical precision, while conducting its own investigation of the facility's vulnerability. Throughout the complex, other prisoners were emerging from their cells as security systems failed in carefully orchestrated sequence. The crystalline beings from Cellblock 5 had been using their harmonic resonances to destabilize specific structural frequencies, guided by sonic maps the human had shared through their brief conversation. The gas-form prisoners had been infiltrating the ventilation systems, carrying messages and small objects between cells under the cover of routine atmospheric circulation.
Even the reptilian prisoners in maximum security had played their part, using their meditative trances to monitor guard rotation patterns and security protocols. Their complaints about the humans weeping had been carefully manufactured distractions, designed to focus administrative attention on irrelevant grievances, while more significant preparations proceeded unnoticed. You exploited every single aspect of our containment protocols, Vextani said, her voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and existential horror. The human nodded with the sort of patient acknowledgement typically reserved for slow students finally grasping difficult concepts. Your psychological manipulation techniques are quite elegant, but they rest on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. You assumed that emotional expression indicated emotional breakdown. You failed to consider that humans are social creatures who use emotional communication as a tool for building alliances and coordinating group activities. The facility's emergency response teams found themselves dealing with a prison break unlike anything in their training manuals. This wasn't a chaotic riot or a desperate escape attempt. It was a precisely coordinated operation that had been planned and executed with military efficiency. Every security protocol had been studied and countered, Every redundant system had been identified and neutralized. Every guard rotation had been mapped and anticipated. The human had spent 3 weeks teaching the other prisoners about human tactics of psychological warfare, social manipulation, and coordinated resistance. Species that had never cooperated before were working together with seamless precision, each contributing their unique abilities to a collective effort that no single prisoner could have accomplished alone. The reptilian prisoners used their natural camouflage to move undetected through the facility's corridors. The crystalline beings generated precise harmonic frequencies that opened locked doors and disabled security barriers. The gas-form creatures infiltrated communication systems and life support networks, carrying information and sabotaging critical infrastructure from within. But the most devastating weapon in the human's arsenal wasn't technological or physical, it was psychological. The creature had weaponized the very research that Dr. Vextani had used to torment it, turning the facility's own behavioral analysis against the guards and administrator. Every alien species in the complex had been studied, their behavioral patterns analyzed, their psychological vulnerabilities identified and exploited. The facility's command structure, designed around the assumption of alien superiority and human inferiority, collapsed as their carefully maintained hierarchies were systematically dismantled. Guards who had spent weeks dismissing human capabilities found themselves outmaneuvered by tactics they had never considered possible. Administrators who had prided themselves on their enlightened approach to corrections discovered that their subjects had been studying them with far greater precision than they had ever applied to their prisoners. This was never about escape, the human explained to Dr. Vextani as they stood in her laboratory surrounded by the wreckage of 3 decades of psychological research. This facility represents everything wrong with the galactic approach to justice. The casual brutality disguised as scientific enlightenment. The systematic dehumanization, justified by academic credentials. The complete failure to recognize the rights and dignity of other species. The evacuation alarms were sounding throughout the complex, but no one was leaving. Instead, the facility had become a broadcasting station, transmitting detailed documentation of illegal imprisonment practices to every major news network in the galaxy. The human had spent weeks gathering evidence, recording conversations and compiling a comprehensive case against the Galactic Penal Consortium's psychological torture program. The revelation that humans could not only resist psychological manipulation, but could reverse engineer and weaponize it sent shockwaves through correctional facilities across 3-star systems. Vextani's research, once hailed as a breakthrough in species-specific containment, became evidence in the largest prison reform scandal in galactic history. As rescue ships arrived to evacuate the facility's staff and transport the illegally detained prisoners to proper diplomatic facilities, Dr. Vextani found herself contemplating the elegant irony of her situation. She had spent her career studying the precise measurement of suffering, only to discover that her subjects had been measuring her with equal precision and considerably more success. The human in Cell 7 Alpha had never stopped being dangerous. The facility's administrators had simply been too arrogant to recognize what kind of danger they were actually dealing with. They had expected a broken victim and had instead encountered a military strategist who specialized in turning institutional strengths into institutional weaknesses. The weeping had stopped not because the human had been broken, but because it had finished gathering the intelligence necessary to break everyone else. The silence that followed hadn't been the absence of resistance. It had been the sound of someone who had learned everything they needed to know and was ready to teach the galaxy a lesson about underestimating human capability. In the end, the Interstellar Correctional Facility became a monument to the dangers of scientific arrogance and the folly of assuming that advanced technology could substitute for basic wisdom about the nature of sentient beings. The facility drifted through space as a derelict warning, its crystalline walls reflecting starlight in patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been designed to contain creatures whose only real crime had been refusing to accept that someone else's definition of civilization was more valid than their own.